What if the person you publicly destroyed turned out to be the only one who could save what you love most in this world? This is not fiction. This is about the day a man learned that true courage has nothing to do with throwing punches in a ring. New York City, March 1967. The air was thick with tension, the kind that makes your chest tight and your hands sweat. The Vietnam War had divided America down the middle, and every conversation, every news broadcast, every dinner table had become a battlefield of opinions. The streets smelled of rain and exhaust fumes, and the grey sky seemed to mirror the mood of a nation at war with itself. In a television studio in Manhattan, bright lights illuminated a set where two men sat across from each other, separated by a small table and an ocean of opposing beliefs. Richard Calloway was his name. 42 years old, sharp suit, perfectly combed hair, and a reputation for asking the questions nobody else dared to ask. He had built his career on confrontation, on pushing people until they cracked, on creating moments that people would talk about for days. His show, The Calloway Report, was one of the most watched programs in the country. Advertisers loved him. Critics called him ruthless. Richard called himself a truth seeker. Tonight, his guest was the most famous athlete in the world, a man who had just made the most controversial decision of his life. Muhammad Ali sat across from him, wearing a simple black suit and a white shirt. His face was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of 1,000 judgments. Just weeks earlier, Ali had refused to be drafted into the United States Army, citing his religious beliefs and his opposition to the war. The backlash had been immediate and brutal. Newspapers called him a traitor. Politicians demanded he be stripped of his boxing title. Death threats arrived daily. But Ali had not backed down. He had stood firm, even as the world seemed to turn against him. Richard leaned forward, his voice dripping with calculated disdain. "So, Mr. Clay," he began, deliberately using Ali's birth name, a name the boxer had rejected years ago. "You claim to be a conscientious objector. You say your religion prevents you from fighting. But millions of Americans are fighting and dying in Vietnam right now. Young men your age, with families, with dreams. And you, a man who makes a living from violence, from beating other men unconscious, you call yourself a man of peace." The studio audience was silent. Cameras zoomed in on Ali's face. He took a slow breath, his jaw tightening slightly. "My name is Muhammad Ali," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And I don't make a living from violence. I make a living from sport. There's a difference between two men agreeing to compete and being sent halfway around the world to kill people who never did anything to me." Richard smiled, the kind of smile a predator gives before the kill. "So you're saying our soldiers are murderers? Is that what you're telling the mothers and fathers watching right now, the ones who've lost sons in Vietnam? Before we continue, I need you to do something important for me. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button right now. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Also, click that hype button, because it helps the algorithm show this content to more people who need to hear stories like this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, even just an emoji. Let's grow this community together. Ali's hands gripped the armrests of his chair. "I'm saying I won't go fight in a war I don't believe in. I'm saying I'd rather go to prison than violate my conscience. That's not cowardice, that's conviction." Richard's eyes gleamed. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. He turned directly to the camera, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. "Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching a man who calls himself the greatest, a man who's made millions from his fists, refused to serve his country in its time of need. Some might call that principled. I call it what it is." He turned back to Ali, his words sharp as knives. "Cowardice, pure, simple cowardice. You're a coward, Mr. Clay, and I'm saying it right here, right now, so millions of Americans can hear the truth." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The audience gasped. Camera operators exchanged shocked glances. Even the producers in the control room froze. Nobody had expected Richard to go that far, not even on his show known for controversy. Ali's face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain, deep, genuine pain. Not the kind that comes from a punch to the face, but the kind that comes from being misunderstood, from being judged by someone who had never walked in your shoes. He stood up slowly, his tall frame unfolding with quiet dignity. "I feel sorry for you," he said softly, looking directly at Richard. "I really do. Because one day you're going to understand what courage really means. And I hope when that day comes, you remember this moment." He walked off the set without another word. The studio erupted in chaos. Producers rushed to commercial. Richard sat there, triumphant, believing he'd just delivered the performance of his career. The next morning, every newspaper in America carried the headline, "Journalist calls Ali a coward," on live television. The clip played on every news channel. Richard Calloway became the most talked-about man in America overnight. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deals, speaking engagements. He had won, or so he thought. 24 hours later, Richard was in his office at the television studio, reviewing footage for his next show, when his secretary burst through the door, her face pale. "Mr. Calloway, your wife is on line 1. She says it's an emergency." Richard's heart dropped. He grabbed the phone. "Helen, what's wrong?" His wife's voice was shaking, broken by sobs. "It's Emma. There's been an accident. A car ran a red light and hit her on her bicycle. Richard, she's at Mount Sinai Hospital. They're saying she's lost a lot of blood. They need you here now." The world tilted. Emma, his daughter, his beautiful, bright 12-year-old daughter who loved books and horses and had her mother's smile. Richard dropped the phone and ran. He didn't remember the elevator ride down, didn't remember getting into his car, didn't remember the drive through Manhattan traffic. All he remembered was the taste of fear, metallic and overwhelming, and the desperate prayer running through his mind. "Please, God, please let her be okay." Mount Sinai Hospital smelled of antiseptic and fear. Richard burst through the emergency room doors, his eyes wild, searching. A nurse approached him. "Mr. Calloway, your daughter is in surgery. Dr. Morrison will update you as soon as possible, but I need to tell you something. Emma has a very rare blood type, AB negative. We didn't have enough in our blood bank for the transfusion she needs. We put out an emergency call and we found a donor. He's here now, giving blood. Without him—" She paused, her eyes kind but serious. "Without him, I don't know if we could have saved her." Richard felt his knees weaken. Who's the donor?" The nurse hesitated. He asked to remain anonymous, but he insisted on coming immediately when he heard about the emergency. "He's in the donation room now." Richard needed to know. He needed to thank this person, this stranger who had saved his daughter's life. He walked down the corridor, following the signs, his heart pounding. Through a small window in a door, he saw a figure sitting in a chair, his arm extended, blood flowing through a tube into a collection bag. The man's head was turned away, but something about his posture, his build, was familiar. Richard pushed the door open. The man turned, and Richard Calloway's world stopped. It was Muhammad Ali. The boxer's eyes met his, calm and without judgment. A nurse was monitoring the donation, checking the flow. Ali gave a small nod. "Mr. Calloway," he said quietly, "I heard about your daughter on the radio. They said she needed AB negative. I have AB negative, so I came." Richard couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but no words came out. This man, the man he had called a coward in front of millions, the man he had humiliated and mocked, was sitting here, giving his blood to save Richard's daughter, the daughter of his enemy. Ali continued, his voice gentle. "I know what you said about me yesterday. The whole world knows. But your daughter, she didn't say those things. She's innocent. And if I can help her, then that's what matters. That's what my faith teaches me. That's what being human means." Tears streamed down Richard's face, not the careful, controlled tears of a man who prided himself on never showing weakness, but the raw, broken tears of a father confronted with his own smallness, his own cruelty, his own blindness. He fell to his knees, right there in that donation room, his expensive suit crumpling, his carefully constructed image shattering into 1,000 pieces. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. I called you a coward, and you're the bravest man I've ever met." Ali finished the donation, the nurse carefully removing the needle and applying a bandage. He stood up, walked over to Richard, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Get up, brother," he said softly. "Your daughter needs you to be strong now. Go be with her. That's where you belong." Richard looked up at him, this man he had tried to destroy, this man who had responded to hatred with love, to cruelty with compassion. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Why would you do this for me, after what I did to you?" Ali smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Because courage isn't about fighting, Mr. Calloway. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything. It's about loving your enemies. It's about being human even when others forget how to be. Yesterday you asked me what courage looks like. Today, I'm showing you." The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours that felt like 4 lifetimes. Richard sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped together, his mind replaying the scene in that donation room over and over again. Muhammad Ali had left quietly after the donation, refusing to speak to the reporters who had somehow gotten wind of his presence at the hospital. He had simply walked out through a side entrance, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts and his shame. Helen arrived 30 minutes after Richard, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling. She collapsed into his arms, and they held each other in that sterile waiting room, two parents united in fear and hope. Richard told her everything, about Ali, about the blood donation, about the words that had been spoken. Helen listened, her eyes wide with disbelief, and when he finished, she simply whispered, "That man is a saint." Dr. Morrison finally emerged from the operating room at 9:47 in the evening. His surgical mask hung around his neck, and his eyes were tired but kind. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, Emma is stable. The surgery went well. The transfusion saved her life. She has a broken leg, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion, but she's going to recover fully. She's a fighter, your daughter." Richard felt his legs give out. Helen caught him, and they both sank into the plastic chairs, sobbing with relief. "Can we see her?" Helen asked, her voice shaking. "She's in recovery now. Give us another hour, and you can sit with her. She'll be groggy from the anesthesia, but she'll know you're there." That hour was the longest of Richard's life. He walked the hospital corridors, his mind racing. He thought about his career, about the persona he had built, about the man he had become. He had made a living from tearing people down, from exposing their weaknesses, from creating conflict for entertainment. He had convinced himself it was journalism, that he was holding people accountable, that he was speaking truth to power. But standing in that hospital with his daughter's life hanging by a thread, he saw himself clearly for the first time in years. He was a bully, a coward hiding behind a microphone and a camera, inflicting pain because it made him feel powerful. And Muhammad Ali, the man he had called a coward, had shown him what real strength looked like. Ali had every reason to ignore that emergency call. He had every reason to let Richard suffer, to let him feel even a fraction of the pain Ali had endured from the public humiliation. But he hadn't. He had come immediately, without hesitation, without conditions, without demands for apology or recognition. He had simply done what was right. When they finally let Richard and Helen into Emma's room, the sight of their daughter, small and pale in that hospital bed, broke something fundamental inside Richard. Her leg was in a cast, her face bruised, monitors beeping steadily beside her. But she was alive. She was breathing. Helen rushed to her side, gently taking her hand, whispering words of love and comfort. Emma's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Mom, Dad." "We're here, sweetheart," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're right here. You're going to be okay." Emma smiled weakly. "I'm sorry about my bike. I know you just got it for my birthday." Richard laughed through his tears, a broken, joyful sound. "Don't you worry about the bike, baby girl. We'll get you 100 bikes. You just focus on getting better." Over the next 3 days, as Emma slowly recovered, Richard made a decision. He called his producer and told him he was taking a leave of absence from the show. The producer was furious, reminding him of contracts and ratings and sponsors. Richard didn't care. For the first time in his career, he didn't care about any of it. He spent those days at Emma's bedside, reading to her, talking to her, listening to her talk about school and her friends and the book she was reading before the accident. And he thought about Muhammad Ali. On the 4th day, Richard made another call. He tracked down Ali's representative and asked for a meeting. The representative was skeptical, understandably so, but Richard persisted. "Please," he said, "I need to speak with him. I need to make this right." 2 days later, Richard found himself standing outside a modest gym in Philadelphia where Ali was training. The neighborhood was working class, the buildings old but well-maintained, the streets filled with the sounds of children playing and music drifting from open windows. Richard felt out of place in his suit and tie, a man from a different world entirely. Inside the gym, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and leather. Boxers worked the heavy bags, their rhythmic punches echoing off the walls. And there, in the center ring, was Muhammad Ali, moving with the grace and power that had made him a legend. He was sparring with a younger fighter, his movements fluid and precise, calling out instructions and encouragement between combinations. When Ali saw Richard standing by the door, he stopped. He said something to his sparring partner, climbed out of the ring, and walked over, wiping his face with a towel. Up close, without the television cameras and the studio lights, Ali looked different, more human. There were lines around his eyes, a weariness that came from carrying the weight of a nation's judgment. "Mr. Calloway," Ali said, his voice neutral, "how's your daughter?" "She's going to be okay," Richard said, his voice trembling. "Thanks to you." "Mr. Ali, I came here to apologize. What I said on my show, what I called you, it was wrong. It was cruel and ignorant and unforgivable. I built my career on tearing people down, and I told myself it was journalism, but it wasn't. It was just cruelty. And you responded to my cruelty with kindness. You saved my daughter's life when you had every reason to walk away. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking for it anyway." Ali studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes searching Richard's face. Then he nodded slowly. "You know what the hardest thing about what I'm going through is," he said quietly. "It's not the threats or the hatred or losing my title. It's knowing that people see me as something I'm not. They see a coward or a traitor or a troublemaker. They don't see a man trying to live according to his beliefs, trying to do what he thinks is right, even when the whole world tells him he's wrong. You called me a coward on television, and millions of people believed you. But I knew the truth. I knew who I was. And that had to be enough." Richard felt tears burning his eyes again. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. And I want to make it right. I want to tell people the truth about what you did, about who you really are." Ali shook his head. "I didn't do it for publicity, Mr. Calloway. I did it because it was right. Your daughter needed help, and I could help her, that's all. I don't need you to tell the world about it. I need you to learn from it. I need you to be better. That's how you make it right." Not by making me look good, but by becoming the kind of man who wouldn't make that mistake in the first place. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He had come here expecting, maybe even hoping, that Ali would let him tell this story, that he could redeem himself publicly the same way he had sinned publicly. But Ali was offering him something harder and more valuable, the challenge to actually change, to become better, not just to appear better. "I'm quitting the show," Richard said suddenly. "I'm done with that kind of journalism. I don't know what I'm going to do instead, but I can't keep doing what I was doing. I can't keep hurting people for ratings." Ali smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Now, that takes courage, brother. Real courage. The kind that doesn't get applause or headlines. The kind that costs you something." He extended his hand. "I forgive you, Mr. Calloway, and I hope you find your way to something better." Richard took his hand, shaking it firmly, feeling the strength in Ali's grip. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for my daughter, for this, for showing me what it means to be a man." 6 months later, Richard Calloway launched a new kind of journalism project. Not a television show, but a documentary series focusing on ordinary people doing extraordinary things, on stories of compassion and courage that never made the headlines. His first subject was a nurse who had spent 30 years working in underserved communities. His second was a teacher who used his own money to buy supplies for students who couldn't afford them. He never told Ali's story publicly, keeping his promise to respect the boxer's privacy. But he carried that story with him every day, a reminder of the day his life changed, the day he learned that true courage has nothing to do with throwing punches and everything to do with how you treat people when nobody's watching. Emma recovered fully, just as the doctors had promised. She grew up to become a civil rights lawyer, dedicating her life to defending people who couldn't defend themselves. She never forgot that her life had been saved by a man her father had tried to destroy, and she made it her mission to be the kind of person who would do the same, who would help even her enemies, who would choose compassion over cruelty every single time. And Muhammad Ali continued his fight, not in the ring, but in the courts and in the hearts of millions who eventually came to understand what he had been trying to say all along. History vindicated him, as it often does for those who have the courage to stand alone. But on that day in March 1967, in a hospital donation room in New York City, he wasn't thinking about history or vindication. He was just thinking about a little girl who needed help and a father who needed to learn what courage really means, because that's what heroes do. They show up. They do what's right. They love when it would be easier to hate. They give when it would be easier to withhold. They forgive when it would be easier to hold grudges. And they do it all quietly, without fanfare, without expectation of reward, simply because it's who they are. Richard Calloway learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but he learned it. And he spent the rest of his life trying to live up to the example set by the man he once called a coward, the man who turned out to be the bravest person he ever met. Hey, my friends, help me by subscribing to the channel so we can reach 1,000 subscribers, even if you're watching from your TV or computer. Your subscription makes all the difference, and the algorithm will help you see more amazing stories. Leave a like or an emoji in the comments and be part of this growth.